We're 12 days out from the election, and suddenly we're seeing Kamala Harris everywhere on podcasts and late-night talk shows, on NBC News and Telemundo, on CNN, at the VP's residence, and again, just now, surprise gaggle with reporters in Philadelphia.
Two leaders in the Republican Party, the mayor of Waukesha, and then, of course, former Representative Fred Upton. And this continues to be, I think, evidence of the fact that people who have been leaders in our country, regardless of their political party, understand what's at stake. And they are weighing in courageously, in many cases, in support of what we need to have, which is a president of the United States who understands the obligation to uphold the Constitution of the United States and our democracy.
She is using the FaceTime to try to seize the narrative, working anew to emphasize that Donald Trump is an existential danger, a fascist, she now says. Quote, John Kelly is putting out a 911 call to the American people. Understand what could happen if Donald Trump is back in the White House. Also, quote, he wants unchecked power. Quote, he has contempt for the Constitution of the United States. Quote, he wants a military that is loyal to him. Quote, he's going to sit there unstable, unhinged, plotting his revenge, retribution, creating an enemies list. Quote, let's be clear about who he considers to be the enemy from within. Anyone who refuses to bend a knee or dares to criticize him would qualify like judges, like journalists, like nonpartisan election officials. Clearly, the campaign thinks this is her last chance to convince fence sitters to vote for her. And this is her best message to do that. Is it? As Tom Nichols writes in The Atlantic, for millions of the GOP faithful, however, Donald Trump's daily attempts to breach new frontiers of hideousness are not offensive, but reassuring. They want Trump to be awful. Still, Nichols later argues one ray of hope is that revelations from people like John Kelly do seem to matter. Joining us now, NBC News White House correspondent Errin Gilchrist, who is in Clarkston, Georgia, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hillyard, and the 19th editor-at-large, Errin Haines, who will be attending the Harris rally tonight in Atlanta. Also, senior political reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Greg Bluestein. Both Errin and Greg are MSNBC contributors, we are happy to say. Errin Gilchrist, I'm going to start with you. Tell me a little bit more about what you're expecting to see from Harris tonight, and about this, I don't want to say a total change in messaging, but about this renewed push about Donald Trump the danger, Donald Trump the threat to democracy, Donald Trump the fascist.
Yeah, I think you're definitely hearing a more forceful message coming from the vice president along those lines about how she views former President Trump, how she sees him as a danger to democracy, and her using that as a part of the message for why he should not be reelected, why he should not again be in the Oval Office. Tonight, we can expect to hear the vice president talk a lot about the need for people to actually get out and vote. We know that she has a star-studded lineup with her here in Atlanta, or outside Atlanta, right on the edge of the city here. She, of course, is going to appear with former President Barack Obama. At the same time, we know there'll be a performance from Bruce Springsteen. Tyler Perry is expected to be here. Samuel L. Jackson, Spike Lee. All of these people are folks who are well known for their celebrity, right? These are people who have a lot of folks who pay attention to them, who follow them. And so the campaign is going to be able to use these sorts of surrogates in settings like this throughout the weekend and over the next 12 days leading up to Election Day to tell people that, great, let's get excited. We appreciate the enthusiasm that you've shown over the last many months. Now it's time to turn that enthusiasm into action by way of voting. The vice president likely to encourage people to vote early, as has already happened, to the tune of 25 million plus people around the country. 2 million just here in Georgia, we learned a little while ago, have already voted. So I think you can expect to hear that message from the vice president, encouraging people to do that in the days ahead, and particularly on Election Day on November 5th, Katie.
All right, Greg, let's talk a little bit more about Georgia and what you're seeing down there. So many early votes now cast. Is there a sense that this election feels like 2020 or like 2016?
That's such a good question, because there has been an extraordinary amount of early votes cast, in-person record set for early in-person voting here in Georgia. But as we just saw from the makeup, it is relatively split down the middle, and it's a good thing for both parties, but particularly for Republicans here, because Republicans weren't encouraging early voting in past presidential elections. They are now, and so there's a sense of confidence for Republicans that they're getting out and turning out the early vote, doing what Democrats have long done in Georgia. We don't know whether or not that's just a transfer from election day voting to early voting, or if this is a real big surge in newcomers. But we do know, as we can see from that chart, that there's a huge number of there's a big female advantage, and every single poll that we've had in Georgia shows this enormous gender gap, with women overwhelmingly supporting Vice President Kamala Harris.
Let me play a little bit from Harris last night on CNN addressing voters who are still making a decision.
And frankly, I think of it as he's just putting out a 911 call to the American people.
Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. When he was president, during extreme disasters, when it came time to determine how those areas, those people who had been traumatized by extreme weather would get relief, he asked the question, did they vote for him? I believe the American people deserve better.
All right, so the he that she was first referring to, Errin Haines, was John Kelly. This is the news yesterday, that John Kelly came out and decided to say, with his own voice, recorded by the New York Times in an interview, that Donald Trump is a fascist, that he wants to be a fascist, that he's the kind of person that wants a military that is completely loyal to him. And when you look at some polling done, and this is what Tom Nichols is pointing to in the Atlantic piece, saying that there is some evidence to suggest that the messaging could work with some undecided voters that Donald Trump's a danger, not because Kamala Harris is saying it, but because John Kelly's saying it, because members of his White House are saying it, senior ranking members like, Mike Pence, who's not, supporting him, or, General Milley, who's been reported to not be supportive of him, or Mark Esper, who's been pretty public about it, all of these senior ranking officials. And in this internal polling, this is done by a Democratic group, the single best issue to convince overall voters, but also independent voters, is that Donald Trump's own people don't think he's fit for the job. What are you seeing about this messaging? Are you seeing any evidence of that in Georgia, which is such a purple state?
Well, it's unclear what effect John Kelly's comments are going to have on this election. But what we have heard in focus groups, people like Sarah Longwell have said, when people who are not going to vote for the former president, but could be potentially open to voting for Vice President Harris, a thing that could persuade them is hearing from people like the generals who have, a tremendous amount of credibility, people who work closely with the president and are speaking out. Those people have credibility, which I think, again, is why you see Vice President Harris kind of flooding the zone and continuing to hammer this message in the home stretch about the former president being a threat to the democracy, talking about the Constitution, having people, being on the stump with people like Liz Cheney last week to really talk about the threat to democracy as part of her really important closing argument. But I mean, even if she's only been at the top of the ticket for just 3 months, she's trying to define herself while also trying to remind people of who former President Trump is. That, as election season is underway, is the thing that could make the difference, right, with that handful of undecided voters that are still out there, as we're seeing people casting ballots in these record numbers. An interesting point that I would make, with that early voting number that we're seeing, the record numbers that we're seeing in North Carolina and Georgia, with you seeing, kind of this even split between Democrats and Republicans in places like Georgia, but also this huge gender gap. That also raises the question, could some of these Republicans that are casting ballots also be women who might be casting a ballot for Harris? It's going to be very interesting to see if that is what is happening in some of this early voting.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I wanted to ask you next. I mean, if you're thinking about Atlanta, Georgia in particular, but Atlanta and places like Buckhead in Atlanta, I wonder what the suburban, and that's a place that can go back and forth. I wonder what the suburban women psyche is in a town like that, in an area like that. Do you have any sense of how maybe the fence voters in Metro Atlanta might be feeling? Because they could be the ones that put this over the top in that state.
We have certainly done reporting in Georgia at the 19th on the suburban women who could make the difference. And one of the issues that could make the difference for those suburban women is the issue of gun violence, which is also something that Vice President Harris has talked about. She's talked about it on the campaign trail. She certainly talked about it here in Georgia, and she continues to talk about abortion and reproductive rights here in Georgia. Obviously, we know that Georgia and the 6-week abortion ban that has been at issue in this state has been something that has animated a lot of voters, particularly women voters, to go to the polls, and is probably on the minds of a lot of voters going, as they are early voting in these record numbers here in Georgia. I expect, her to continue that messaging when she is here. But also, I mean, you have to remember that Georgia was a state that was targeted by the former president, accused of election fraud, accused of being part of the rigged election, which of course we know is not something that happened. But I mean, this was the scene where you had former President Trump begging for those, almost 12,000 votes from Georgia elected officials and trying to disqualify a lot of voters. That may also be a thing that is really motivating and galvanizing a lot of voters. It's certainly something that Vice President Harris is going to be reminding people here about headed into that home stretch as well.